Hello and welcome to Ye Olde Guide, the podcast that uncovers the hidden history and heritage of England's towns and cities. Today we're heading to Stockport, a town built in layers. Beneath your feet, rivers rush through culverts. Above you, the market square clings to the hillside, whilst overhead, the colossal brick viaduct soars past. Deep below, wartime tunnels snake through the bedrock. This is a place where you don't just walk, but you climb, as we found when we visited. My name is Liam McGrath, and I'm delighted to introduce Ye Olde Guide's historian, Daniel Gooch. What was the highlight of your trip to Stockport then, Daniel?
Do you want a history highlight or non-history?
Oh, any highlight.
I'll go non-history. We're going to talk about history enough today. My non-history highlight was the excellent cake I had at the market there. Stockport Market's brilliant. There was a vegan cake stall, had more cakes than I could believe, and very hard to choose, but it was excellent. I wish I could remember the name of it. If you go to Stockport, go on the market day, go and have some of the food there. It's really good.
And proof there that you can be vegan and unhealthy if you choose to be.
Yep, there are ways and means.
Also, lots of good pubs in Stockport. We'll come back to that. Well, thank you all for listening and for your feedback on recent episodes. We had some feedback on Nottingham and Brighton, which we're going to cover in another episode because there's quite a bit of stuff to cover there. So we'll do another episode for that. If you have any more comments for us, please do leave them at our website, yeoldeguide.com, or you can just leave them wherever you get your podcasts. That's also good, and we love a bit of feedback. So, as ever on Ye Olde Guide, we're shining a light on lesser-known histories of English towns. And Stockport is not on the typical tourist trail, but we'll be making a case for why you should visit. From the Hat Museum to the underground air raid shelters, the historic marketplace and the fantastic local museum and music scene, as well as the pubs, there is a lot to discover. And so that we dig both deeply and broadly into the history of Stockport, we break our podcast episode down into 4 sections. And first of all, we'll be covering politics and war. Second, science and industry. Third, arts and culture. And then finally, urban landscape. At the end of the podcast, we will reflect on how Stockport compared to our expectations. And due to our obsession with numbers and competition, we will be scoring the historical interest of Stockport in each of those categories. But before we dive into Stockport's past, let's set the scene. If you've ever taken a train to Manchester from the south, chances are you've passed through Stockport. You've probably crossed over the vast brick viaduct, and you've probably looked over at the town below. And you might not know much about it. You might just assume it's another Manchester suburb. But Stockport is independent, and it's always been much more than that. It historically developed as its own centre, closely tied to Manchester, of course, through trade, but distinct in identity. Today, Stockport is one of the 10 metropolitan boroughs that make up Greater Manchester, a county formed in 1974. The geography of this region is fascinating. Manchester, of course, the big metropolis in the centre, but it's surrounded by a ring of former mill towns, places like Oldham, Bury, Bolton, Rochdale, Ashton-under-Lyne, and others. And these towns once powered the world's cotton industry alongside Manchester. Stockport shares much with these towns, but it also stands apart in 2 key ways, as we will see. Its industrial roots are older and more diverse than the classic cotton towns. And its geography is uniquely stacked, and we're going to talk about that as well. Things are layered on top of each other in Stockport, and we'll talk about that in our urban landscape section. But for now, we can picture Stockport has built up from the lowest level, which is the River Mersey, where the fast-flowing rivers that gave it its prosperity weave through the town. Today, much of that industrial past remains, but the townscape is also fractured by new development and centuries of change. To understand how it came to be this way, we need to look back. So, as ever on the podcast, we're going to begin with a historical overview. So, Daniel, how far can we go back in the history of Stockport?
Well, the origins of Stockport, as with many other towns, shrouded in mystery and speculation, because there isn't that much source material. Even archaeological evidence from before the Middle Ages is patchy. A few items from prehistoric periods have been found across wider Stockport, but they're all one-off chance finds, burial sites, tools, that kind of thing. Nothing that really demonstrates a pattern or presents evidence of major settlement, and nothing at all in the centre of Stockport. There's nothing from the Bronze Age or the Iron Age either. And when we talk about the centre of Stockport, it's probably worth delineating at this point which area we're talking about, because the town really crosses kind of three counties. It's partly in Cheshire, partly in Lancashire, partly in the historic county of Derbyshire. The overall metropolitan borough spans these three separate historical counties, and that's what we'll consider in total. But the central part, the historic town of Stockport, is the centre of most historical development, the only part that's been recognisable as a significant town for most of Stockport's history. So that's the key part that we'll focus on today. But going back to the origins, it's a fair speculation that the town, this kind of central bit of Stockport, was established because it was a good location to ford over the River Mersey. The ford was still being used until the 1790s, roughly, and could still be seen at low water until about a century later. It's also been conjectured that the Roman road between Buxton and Manchester may have crossed the river at Stockport. There's no direct evidence, but a few Roman coins have been found in Cheadle where the road might have passed. Later, the Saxons might have built a village called Stockport, meaning either marketplace or castle at the hamlet. No one is certain which. But again, really this is speculation. It's based mainly on inference from limited archaeological evidence and the etymology of the town's name. By the Norman conquest, we start to have more documentation covering the area. The borough population was probably a few hundred. Stockport itself isn't in the Domesday Book. It might just not have been surveyed, of course, but it could also suggest total destruction during William I's harrying of the north, particularly as there's evidence of other areas in the Stockport borough having their values massively decrease following William's devastation. But we are talking, as we said, specifically about the central part of the modern borough today. Cheadle, which is a village on the outskirts of Stockport now, was a reasonably notable place at that time and seems to have maintained its value between 1066 and 1086, according to Domesday. Stockport was granted its market charter in 1260. There was an increase in settlements within the Stockport area during the Middle Ages, and the town at this point gained its castle. Also, Stockport itself, this central area, the township at the centre of the present borough, became a barony, giving it precedence over the surrounding area and becoming the largest community, albeit still really no larger than really a village in modern terms. And this is the first period for which an early textile trade, which later became so important to the town, is evidenced. The population of this central town area was probably about 1,500 by the mid-1660s, having roughly doubled in the preceding century, with more living in the surrounding rural areas that now fall within that modern borough. But the next stage in Stockport's history was its most formative, as industrialisation completely changed the town. The population had reached 5,000 around 1780, and pictures of the town from the late 18th century still depict a fairly small settlement delineated by the green hills surrounding it. But it was from then that industry started its huge expansion, both in population and growth into the surrounding borough. Mills and factories began popping up everywhere through the next century, and serious expansion beyond the historical town limits started. Transport links developed, with Stockport connected to the National Canal network by 1800 and around 1840 to the railway network.
The rivers running through the town were never navigable, and you can see why when you visit. They're fast flowing, and that's what gave it the energy. The Peak Forest Canal linked Stockport to Manchester, or just outside Stockport. And while the rivers provided the energy, it was the canals and the railways that enabled the trade and the growth of its industries. And it had diverse industries, didn't it?
Yeah, definitely. It's most famous, say, probably for its hat manufacturing. The football team, Stockport County, is nicknamed the Hatters. But there was also brewing, other textiles, engineering, and much more besides carried on in the town. Now, these industries declined, a familiar story in the 20th century, with the last hat factory closing in 1997. And Stockport became a much changed place as 20th century developments, such as the Mersey Way shopping centre, supermarkets, and roads came to replace much of the Victorian urban legacy of textile mills and railways. But Stockport still retains much of its old Victorian industrial aesthetic at its core. And we're going to explore more of that and how it came to be in this episode. To get deeper into the history of Stockport, I think we're going to start from our first category, aren't we?
Our first category is politics and war. Now, Daniel, you've spoken about there being evidence of a settlement before the Norman conquest. What evidence of political history do we have in the town?
Well, I suppose evidence of Stockport's political and military importance comes most obviously in Stockport Castle, because Stockport used to have its very own castle right in the centre of the current town in the area now called Castle Yard. Some historians suggest it may have been built on the site of a Roman fortification, but this is mainly guesswork based on where people think the Roman roads might have met. There's very limited archaeological evidence of Roman finds on the site. Now, the first proper documentary evidence of the castle is in one of the earliest references to the town's name itself, in a chronicle of the rebellion against King Henry II by his sons, who included Richard the Lionheart and John. The chronicle lists castles held by rebels against the king, though it was a lesser lord, not one of the royal princes, which seems to be a slight local myth, who actually held the castle. The castle quickly went out of use after this rebellion and was possibly demolished then. There were stone walls still standing for much longer, and these can be seen on the earliest surviving maps of Stockport, but they were demolished in the 17th century, with the motte, the hill on which the castle was constructed, flattened in 1775 to allow construction of the town's first cotton mill, also called the Castle. So a rather symbolic historical change there. So not much actually happened at the castle. It didn't see any real military action, but the fact that it existed at all reflects Stockport's prominence as a proper town and centre of a barony controlling the surrounding manors, rather than a collection of tiny settlements by the 12th century.
Now, I don't recall seeing a castle. Is there anything of it left?
Apart from the name Castle Yard, probably not. Some of the stone walls below the marketplace are said to, that old phrase, said to have been connected with the castle, or otherwise been town walls of some description. But there's no reliable evidence that they were ever used for defensive or military purposes. Town walls were quite rare in this region in the Middle Ages, and there's no clear reason why Stockport would have had them exceptionally, nor do we actually know why these walls were built. It's probably thought more likely by most local historians that they were built to, instead, just for a functional purpose of holding the ground up from erosion.
So, listeners visiting Stockport, don't get overexcited about there being a castle. There is not a castle that we can visibly see, but it would have been a commanding elevation in that location. If you look at the location of Castle Yard, it's up there at the height of the marketplace. Can you tell us about any other fortifications that were added?
Well, yes, I can. And this brings us neatly onto our old favourite, the Civil War.
Yes.
Because Stockport had some fortifications added, same as with many other towns during the Civil War, which were taken down in December 1642 as part of a local truce. To give an overview of Stockport's role in the Civil War, some royalist prisoners were held in the town, as Stockport was held by parliamentarians throughout, aside from a couple of days in late May 1644. Now, this changeover happened following a small scrap near the bridge over the Mersey. The royalist commander, Prince Rupert, was leading what you'd probably describe as a rampage throughout Lancashire in 1644. The parliamentarians had hoped to stop him advancing at the bridges at Stockport and Warrington, where another Mersey crossing was. You can listen to our Warrington episode for more on what happened there. And there were 3,000 soldiers defending the town. But Prince Rupert came to the town in May 1644 with many more soldiers, probably about 8,000 to 10,000. So the defending parliamentarians scarpered, apart from some musket men who fired from behind hedges before they were driven away. So the royalists captured a few hundred prisoners, stayed here and in the area for a day before continuing their advance and allowing the parliamentarians to re-enter the town, where they stayed until the end of the war.
And there you have it, another reference to the Civil War in Ye Olde Guide. Mm-hmm. It's a tradition. Now, I'm going to zoom forward to the 20th century for our next sort of development of fortifications, if you like, or sort of wartime infrastructure, probably more accurately, to one of the best visitor attractions in Stockport today.
Yep. One of Stockport's main historical tourist attractions is the large public Second World War air raid shelters. They were dug out from 1938 to provide public protection from air raids during the Blitz and were pretty huge, with a capacity of 6,500 roughly, fitting into almost a mile of tunnels.
So that sounds quite exceptional. Why were they built?
The idea to build them came when buildings on Chestergate's south side were demolished to make room for a new road and showed cellars dug in behind them. The first idea was to extend these into a car park underground, but later, as the political climate changed and war started to look more and more inevitable, it was decided to turn them into air raid shelters. A trial tunnel was dug, which showed you could make a big enough tunnel about 7 feet wide and high without the need for extra supports holding the tunnel up, which would help keep the tunnels cheap. The first 2 tunnels opened in October 1939, with more to follow. There were initially 2 main tunnels with 14 smaller ones crossing in between the 2 of them. It was quite rare to have such large public shelters outside London, so they are quite unique in that sense. People even came from Manchester to use them, and about 200 people ended up living in them on a semi-permanent basis at one point. Now, the tunnels were extended further in 1940, but by 1943, the council decided to stop keeping them permanently open and instead just opened them as and when needed. 3 systems were dug. You had Chestergate, Dodge Hill and Brinksway. It's the Chestergate shelters which were the biggest, and these extended the existing caves. It was nicknamed the Chestergate Hilton, possibly because you had so many people living there on a semi-permanent basis. And these are the ones that you can visit today since they opened for tours in 1990. They still retain some of the original features, like benches, beds and toilets from the Second World War. And as well as the open tunnels, there are plenty of others about or underneath the town. There are numerous blocked off tunnels. Some people have managed to make their way in and take photos showing, again, original features not touched for decades. Bunk beds still in there running along the lengths of the tunnels. It doesn't take much Googling to find that. So, fascinating aspect of military history under Stockport's ground.
Yeah, it's a pretty cool attraction, actually, and it's part of that layered history of Stockport going underground. And there's one more attraction under the streets.
Yes, sometimes called the Dungeon, a great historical attraction. It's the centuries-old cell below the court in Stockport, which was there from the 15th to 18th century and used as a cell there, and prisoners were held there while awaiting trial. When it stopped being used as a cell, it was later used as a shop, H&H Hooper Greengrocers. The cell was underground, so offered this handy, cool environment for preserving stock for the shop. And there are plenty of photos you can see which show it in use as that. And the cell is still there at the top of Mealhouse Brow, next to the marketplace. You can see the entrance door from the outside very easily, and Stockport Heritage Trust has the lease and has restored it for occasional openings, so you can go in if you're there on the right day.
We'll talk a bit about Stockport's political history now. It doesn't have a huge amount it's known for, but it is closely tied to one of the most significant events in the struggle for democratic reform in Britain, the Peterloo Massacre of 1819. This took place in the middle of Manchester in St. Peter's Field, and at the time, Britain was grappling with deep economic hardship following the Napoleonic Wars, and the political system was wildly unbalanced. Many rapidly growing industrial towns in the north, like Manchester and Stockport, had virtually no representation in Parliament, whilst the so-called rotten boroughs, like Old Sarum and Dunwich, which we covered in our Lost Cities episode, well, they were still sending 2 MPs to Parliament each, despite having barely anyone living in them. So on the 16th of August 1819, around 60,000 people gathered in Manchester city centre to demand parliamentary reform and expanded voting rights. But the protest was violently broken up by the local Ye Olde cavalry who charged into the crowd with weapons drawn. At least 18 people were killed and 100 injured, many of them women and children. The massacre shocked the nation and became a turning point in the campaign for reform. It's had a lasting impact on political consciousness in towns like Stockport, where working class communities were increasingly engaged in the fight for representation and rights. What was the contribution of Stockport to this historical event? Was it significant?
Well, given that Stockport was a significant industrial town near Manchester, it's no surprise to learn that many of the attendees at Peterloo, probably a few thousand, came from Stockport. 46 of the wounded are reported to have come from the town, with one Stockport man surviving, having a piece of his skull cut off. It was later shown to Parliament as evidence of the excessive force used on that day. There were also strikes and organised union societies set up in Stockport in the month leading up to Peterloo. So Peterloo was certainly an important event for the people of Stockport.
And it went onwards in the 19th century through the Chartist movement, which was more of a campaign for political reform. And Stockport had some individuals that were deeply involved, as were other cities in that area. There was a flashpoint in 1842 called the Plug Plot Riots. This was a wave of strikes across the north, including Stockport, and workers walked out of mills and there were confrontations. So this was, for many cities, but including Stockport, a wave of political activism. But beyond that, not a huge amount to say on politics, but some interesting history on migration and how that expanded the population. How did migration impact the town?
Well, yeah, I suppose the context here is what was happening in industrial towns throughout the 18th and 19th century as they were rapidly expanding, and these people have got to come from somewhere. You look at pretty much any industrialised town, they were drawing people in from their hinterland, from further afield, people coming in for employment. And one of the things you'd say about Stockport is that much of the expanded population was Irish. The Irish-born comprised about a 14th of the population in 1841, and about 1 in 10 by the early 1850s, though, as the local historian Peter Arrowsmith points out, the actual Irish community in Stockport would have been larger than this because this figure didn't include Irish people who were born outside Ireland, second generation Irish, children of the Irish, and perhaps their spouses. So the actual Irish community would have felt bigger in Stockport. And relations certainly weren't always harmonious. There was an anti-Irish riot in 1852, fueled by a combination of anti-Catholic feeling, probably xenophobia, and this sense that increasing numbers of Irish workers were undercutting wages in the town for the locals. One of the catalysts was a fight between an Irishman and an Englishman in what was, until a few years ago, the Gladstone pub on Middle Hillgate. I think it's closed now. Irish homes and 2 Catholic churches were attacked in the resulting riot, about 100 injured and 1 person killed. And in later years, some pubs introduced physical segregation in pubs to keep English and Irish customers apart. So it wasn't always harmonious coexistence.
Oh gosh, it's like a football day out.
I mean, yeah, I didn't want to say it. I didn't want to be the first.
Separate parts of the pub. All right, amazing. Well, that was I think that concludes our section on politics and war. But what do you think? What's your summary of this element of Stockport's history?
Well, this was never likely to be Stockport's strongest category. You've had almost really no big formal military action. All you have mentioned in histories of the town are the scrap at the bridge in the Civil War. The only other thing I could find mentioned at all was Bonnie Prince Charlie passing by Stockport on his march south to and from Derby, which doesn't sound that notable. But there is in Stockport a bit more on the political and military experience of ordinary people in fights for parliamentary and labour reforms, and I suppose most importantly, in the impact of the Blitz on the population. While Stockport's experience may not have been particularly unique, it deserves credit for the preservation of the air raid shelters and its reopening as a visitor experience. So I think there's something there. So it's not going to be a particularly high score, but it's not going to be a disaster. It's going to be 3 out of 10 for me. Just as a reminder, we start on 5 and go up or down. So 3 is not a terrible score.
That's not a bad score at all. And I also agree, those air raid shelters are pretty cool. I wish the castle was still there. So for me, it's a 3.
Okay, 3 each, 6 out of 20. But I think the score is going to pick up in the next category.
Our second category is science and industry. And we said in the introduction that Stockport has an older and more diverse industrial history than some of the other towns in the region. And we said it kicked off in the Industrial Revolution. But before we get into that explosive period of growth, and we've got a lot to say about that, let's start with the pre-industrial industries of Stockport.
Yeah. So in the Middle Ages, the main commercial activities were agriculture in the wider area around Stockport, which continued to be the main economic activity in the wider area up to the 17th century. There was also work in obtaining peat for fuel from the surrounding mosslands, while trade was also important. We said earlier Stockport was granted its first market charter in 1260, and the marketplace, the centre of trade in the town, remains at the centre of Stockport now. But Stockport's boom period, and what we need to focus on today, came after industrialisation, and Stockport came to have quite a diverse industrial base, which is reflected, I think, very well in the exhibits in Stockport Museum. You have things on coal mining, engineering, metalworks, brickmaking and brewing. Plus, of course, hats, and then you had jam making, mineral water and chocolate. They had really the full diversity of trade and industry that you'd expect in an industrial town.
Well, you mentioned hats, but let's get to hats. Let's start with textiles and how this led to this hat industry.
Yeah, textiles, really the kind of the earliest and most important major mechanised industry. The textile industry, you're right, was the precursor to hat manufacturing, for which the town remains famous. But it was also really important in its own right. To go back to its earliest origins, cloth weaving was probably practiced in Stockport from about the 13th century, with production expanding in the 15th, in common with many other Lancashire towns at this time. But one of the first fabrics to be produced on a major scale in Stockport was silk. Stockport was one of the first places in England where mass silk manufacturing was made possible after techniques were imported from Italy. The first factories in Stockport produced this silk, with the earliest mill built in 1732 using water. This was the Northwest's earliest water-powered factory and one of the country's first. It was 5 stories high and roughly on the site of the recently closed Sainsbury's in the town centre next to the River Mersey.
How important was the silk industry to Stockport?
I think we can get a sense of this by how many facilities and people were involved in it. By 1773, there were 4 large silk mills in the town, while there were several smaller ones dotted about and some in the wider area of the borough. Altogether, 2,000 people roughly were employed in the silk mills. There was, according to an estimate in 1769, around a third, maybe more, of the town's population then. The silk mill owners were dubbed at the time Stockport's chief tradesmen, which demonstrate just how important silk was at the time.
So what then happened to silk production in the town?
Well, it hit some hard times in 1772. There was a depression in the British silk industry, and the largest employer in the town went bankrupt in that year, with their mills being auctioned off the next year. There's parliamentary evidence showing that the workforce in those large 4 mills, which we mentioned, had been about 1,000, was reduced to less than 200 at this point. There was a bit of a revival subsequently, and silk was still being made in Stockport until at least the 1830s, but many of the mills started to be repurposed for cotton, including the Park Mill from the 1780s. Peter Arrowsmith, again, he theorises that the cotton industry moved in so easily because not just they already had large premises to occupy, but because Stockport's population had already grown used to factory work and acquired skills that could cross over into cotton.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's talk about this change from silk to cotton because it's so important. And this was because cotton had become more easily available than silk, I suppose, with imports from the British colonies in America and India. And I suppose trade from Italy and China was more easily disrupted. And cotton had become easier to mechanise. Innovations like Arkwright's water frame in 1769, the spinning jenny, which I think we've discussed before, in 1764. And cotton clothes were just easier to use and wash. So cotton became more popular than silk. And how did this happen in Stockport? How did the cotton industry grow?
Well, by the 18th century, you had linen and wool being woven in Stockport and in the surrounding area by self-employed weavers who'd work in their own homes. This was the putting out system. They'd use hand looms and often work as families. Cloth traders would give the weavers materials and pay them to produce cloth, which they would then sell. You then have local people engaged in finishing cloth, for example, dyeing it or trimming it. And then the factory system took over just as cotton manufacturing started to move into the old silk production premises and new cotton mills were built. The first water-powered cotton mill was Castle Mill, which we mentioned earlier, built in 1778, located at Castle Yard near the marketplace. It was oval in shape, so looks quite distinct in pictures. In the 1790s, one person from Stockport described it as like one of the grandest prisons in the world.
Oh, wow. So why so much cotton in Stockport? What advantages did the town have?
Well, we've already talked about the existing workforce having skills that could cross over, being used to the factory system. But you also had lots of good water power for the mills. Lots of mills were powered by the River Goyt, channeled underground by tunnels. So most local historians think that was also a very important contributory factor.
Yeah, so that river power seems to be essential to the growth of the town's industry. And how important did cotton become to the town?
Well, we can look at the data again. From the 1780s onwards, when the factory system started to replace domestic production of cotton in the home, some estimates are that up to 3/4 of the Stockport population either worked in the cotton industry or were supported by someone who did. So it's very important. It is, yes. And Stockport was the second biggest cotton producer in the region behind Manchester in the early 19th century. And cotton mills were all over the place at that time. The town was called a forest of chimneys in 1842. Many of these mills were concentrated in the park, where that Sainsbury's on Warren Street was until recently, in the town centre, where one of those early silk mills had previously been. Most of the early factories were powered by water, though a few were powered by wind, so were built along those rivers. There are still loads of tunnels leading off from the Mersey, from all the old mills that used to be in the area, most of which have been demolished. And again, your intrepid urban explorers, easily found on the internet, have been exploring those old tunnels for years. Steam power was later introduced and used in all mills in Stockport by the 1830s, but this also required a supply of water. So again, many of the steam mills and factories were also built along the river.
I mean, it would have looked remarkable. There's the Lowry painting. I think it's just called something like Industrial Landscape Stockport, which has got the viaduct and then behind it just seemingly endless chimneys. So you've said that 3/4 of the population relied upon the cotton industry one way or another. What other industries were there?
Well, you had tangent industries like bleaching, printing of cloth, small-scale engineering and iron foundries all connect to the cotton trade. So you did have other industries growing up in their own right. You had also other trades which were bound up in their own right and closely connected with cotton. But a slump followed again from about the 1830s. And by the 1880s, things hadn't lasted. Stockport was only fifth of the cotton-producing towns in the region. The cotton famine of the 1860s hit Stockport hard. Possibly overproduction did as well, and there was a further depression in the cotton industry in the late 1870s.
The cotton famine is something we've covered before on the podcast, but it was essentially the American Civil War leading to raw cotton supplies being cut off, which caused a lot of problems in the north of England. Cotton was a big deal then. Do we have many major industrial innovations coming out of Stockport in particular?
Well, one important technical legacy was in the development of the steam-powered power loom, with some early pioneering use in Stockport factories, major introduction of the technology by the 1830s. The power loom allowed the entire process of weaving to be done with steam power rather than manually on a frame, which was, of course, a very important development in the mechanisation of cloth weaving. Power looms were one of the reasons for the Luddite attacks on factories, something we covered in our Nottingham episode, and which also occurred in Stockport in 1812.
And the legacy of this is lots of mills, some of which are unfortunately somewhat dilapidated and abandoned, but many have been gradually turned into housing and shops. So there's a big old bleach works at Cheadle, which is now housing. There's Meadow Mill in the city centre opposite Tesco Extra. Pear New Mill in the east of the city centre. And these mills are all quite big and impressive buildings, 6-7 stories high. In the centre of the town is the Weir Mill, which is right by the brand new bus station on the west side of the viaduct by the Mersey. And that site goes back to 1790, but it's had numerous developments. And the rail viaduct kind of goes over it. I think it was actually built over part of the mill. And the redeveloped mill, the mill is being redeveloped into flats. And there's some great pictures of that development ongoing as we record, I believe. Now, another big mill is the Wellington Mill. And this is the one that you see from miles around, or you can definitely see it from the railway viaduct. It's got a 61-metre chimney. It was built in 1830. The chimney was added in 1860. And it's 7 stories high with an early fireproof cast iron frame. Now, this mill today it's home of the Hats Works. So it's now time, I think, to talk a bit about hats.
Yes, possibly Stockport's most famous and kind of unique industry, hat making. There are records of hats being made in the wider region as far back as the 16th century, but hatting was properly established in Stockport from the 17th century. Again, this was at first a domestic industry with hats made in homes, but the trade really took off from the 19th century when the production process became mechanised. There was not so much making by hand at that point. From the early days, Stockport's hatting firms had a good reputation. An 1814 review said, "The best English hats are made in London and Stockport." So clearly people thought well of them, or at least that person did. The major period of growth was the late 19th century, with the number of people working in the hat industry increasing tenfold between 1860 and 1890. And this happened partly because felt hats became more popular and was helped by new manufacturing techniques and machinery imported from America.
And why was it such a big industry?
Well, partly because just everyone wore hats then. Think of photos of crowd scenes around that time, like football crowds or factory crowds. Everyone's wearing hats. And I was intrigued by why this is. And the best reason I could find for this was because not back then, people worked in dirtier manual industries and they couldn't wash their hair as often. So keeping your hat on was a good way to kind of keep your hair clean. You can imagine people wanting to just protect themselves. They can't wash their hair every day and they're getting industrial grime in there.
Makes sense.
Yep.
Yeah. And I guess it became fashionable and,
Exactly.
you want to fit in. Any firms that I'd have heard of?
Well, by the late 19th century, there were as many as 12 different firms making hats in Stockport. I'll just pick one out, Christie's. It was a large local firm making hats that was, one source says, had the largest factory in Europe by the 1860s, largest hat factory, I should say, with expansion following in the coming decades. The Christie's factory continued until 1997 and was the last in Stockport to close.
Yeah, I think I've heard of Christie's. And you've said the last factory closed in 1997, not that long ago. What caused hatting to decline in Stockport?
The First World War hit the export market hard. After that, you just got changing fashions. You didn't have every single person wearing hats from then on. So you got reduced demand from about the 1930s. You also had competition from cheaper manufacturers elsewhere. The hat factories began to close gradually until, yes, the entire trade disappeared in 1997.
Yeah, well, people can wash their hair, I suppose.
Mhm.
Well, look, personally, I love a good hat. And if you want to see hats, there are seemingly thousands of them in the Hatworks Museum of all different types and variety. And that's in the Wellington Mill. And I had a great time in the Hatworks Museum. Free entry. And it's about as good an exploration of hats as you can imagine, the history of how the hats were made. There's a factory floor with all the old equipment still there and descriptions of how each bit of equipment worked to get you from the fur of the poor animals that were slaughtered to make these hats. And there's a sign in there saying that Stockport made so many hats that it needed 150,000 rabbits a week.
150,000 per week?
I honestly, that's what I saw on the sign in there.
That's a lot of carrots.
It's a lot. Poor things running around on the peaks. I didn't look into how they found the rabbits, but anyway, lots of rabbits and beavers and such things. It's a pretty cool museum. And I noticed in there they had a load of ear protectors available, which suggests they sometimes operate the machinery on the factory floor. It was all quiet when I visited, but a pretty good museum. Mm-hmm. And it's one of the most prominent buildings in the centre because the word Hatworks is written on the chimney. You can't really miss it.
You can see it from the train. You can see it from the train as well when you go through. You have just
absolutely,
passing through. So, yeah.
Absolutely, you cannot miss it. And another prominent building is the Robinson's Unicorn Brewery. And this is quite an interesting place. What's the history of this?
Yeah, well, brewing was historically quite common in many towns of Stockport size, but we will talk about it here because while many other towns, like, for example, where I'm sitting now, Reading, used to have major town centre breweries, and very major one in Reading actually, but lost them years ago, Stockport still retains a significant brewery very close to the town centre. And this is Robinson's Unicorn Brewery, named after the Unicorn pub behind which it was set.
And what's the background of brewing in Stockport?
Well, many pubs historically brewed their own beer, but you've got larger kind of wholesale breweries who started selling to others later on. They started to appear in the early 19th century, but by the end of the 19th century, there were only 6 large breweries left in Stockport, including Robinson's, but Robinson's is the only one left. Now, Robinson's operate hundreds of pubs across the region. Their most famous beer might be one you'd recognise. It's the Trooper Ale. The distinctive bottles have the Iron Maiden Trooper logo on them. And the brewery has a visitor centre, but I don't think they run tours anymore, unfortunately.
No, but you can certainly drink their beer, and plenty of nice pubs in Stockport in which to drink. So we've spoken a lot about the industries of Stockport. I just briefly reflect on what it was like for the people that lived and worked in these industries.
Well, at first, the reaction from many people to the earliest, what we call industrial development in the town, was positive. It was seen as providing new opportunities for all. There's one quote from 1769 which really encapsulates this feeling. At this place, meaning Stockport, poverty is not much felt except by those who are idle, for all persons capable of tying knots may find work in the silk mills. Which all sounds very nice, but to continue this quote, children of 6 years earn £1 a week. Now, my daughter is 6. The idea of her going out to work in a silk mill and being grateful for £1 a week certainly helps contextualise what this person meant by those who are idle. It's not quite the ringing endorsement to modern ears that you might think. And later conditions certainly weren't great. In 1844, Engels talked a lot about Stockport. He said Stockport was renowned as one of the duskiest, smokiest holes and excessively repellent. Now, while he may have had some grounds for exaggeration, admittedly, as we'll see in more detail later in our urban landscape section, Victorian workers' housing could certainly be horribly cramped and dirty. So do keep these quotes in mind as we progress today.
Yeah, definitely a theme of the era. I think that's quite a decent amount of history in the science and industry section. Certainly lots of industry anyway. And do you know what I enjoyed about Stockport's industry is there's still a decent amount of it to see. There could be more, actually. I think we've probably lost a lot of that industrial history. A lot of the mills have probably gone, but the ones that are still there and that are being restored is good. And of course, the Hat Works, you can probably tell I'm a fan, I think is a good museum, and we've got the Robinson's Brewery as well. So on that basis, I had a pretty enjoyable science and industry round. So I'm giving Stockport a 7.
7, that is a good score. Well, few points here. I think industry clearly was important to Stockport. It had its own kind of unique hold in the popular imagination in the hat industry. A few important technical innovations in the cotton industry as well. I think we have to think about that. The first water mill in the northwest. You have kind of Stockport containing some of the early seeds in nearby growth of Manchester and other industrial towns in the region. So I think it's decent scores for that. But also I like the fact that you can actually feel it when you're there. You still get lots of these mills around you. I know you mentioned lots of it's disappeared, but there's still plenty there that you can see, plenty there you can visit. It didn't just have a hat industry, it celebrates it. It didn't just have mills, it's redeveloping lots of those mills. It didn't just have tangential industries. You can go to the Stockport Museum and they celebrate them properly. You can actually learn about them in a really nice way there. So while it won't be the absolute top scores that places who've kind of given birth to new industrial revolutions would get, it's still going to be pretty good for me. I'm going to give it a 7.5.
Oh, wow. Oh, I thought you were going to go lower than me. Wow. You never know. All full of surprises, this podcast. Marvellous stuff. Well, we're out of time for today. But join us next time for Stockport Part 2, where we'll be covering the culture of Stockport. Spoiler alert, it's home to a very famous recording studio, which we love. We'll also be covering urban landscape, including the multi-layered construction of the town, its finest buildings like the Market Hall, the Town Hall, and that enormous viaduct. If you've enjoyed the podcast, why not leave a rating or review? Stockport Part 2 will be released in a fortnight. See you then.